to the first unfolding of the Shadowroot. I am the Hag Under the Wood, Caitlin to some, but here I am a folk herbalist, a dark fantasy author, and a recovering overconfident human. You know those types. At 35, I am married and childless by design. I found my place in the margins, feral, tender, and deeply rooted in the old magics of ink, soil, and story. Everything that makes me the perfect Hag Under the Wood. I am the one in the thicket, whispering to the herbs and ghosts and scribbling spells in the dirt, laughing at my own terrible puns because I'm hilarious. This podcast is an audio hearth to my Elder Creek Apothecary, dedicated to history, lore, and the magic of the Ohio River Valley. It's the quiet medicine found in the shadows. Today we are going to be tracing a line from a musty hotel room in Texas to the ancient limestone of Kentuckiana. We're going to be looking for the magic in the marrow of my own story. But before we go back to the dirt, I have to tell you, the river really has been restless lately, and there's a man in the murky water. He said something about waiting for us, but I don't really understand. I think in order to understand why he's rising, we first have to understand how I fell. To the dark, let's settle in. I hope you have something warm in your hands. Today, I am drinking what I like to call chaos tea. It is a result of being a neurodivergent herbalist. Essentially, everything in here is what I have in my herbal junk drawer at this time. It's a little bit of bugwort for dreams, my favorite plant, some dried apple for sweetness, and a pinch of cedar I harvested from the creek last week. Cedar is super protective, and honestly, I just love the way that it smells when it's warmed up. It's messy, it's unlabeled, and it's exactly what I need to get through this podcast episode today. You may not know this, but I've never done a podcast before on my own, and so this will all be a brand new experience for me, and I hope you enjoy the journey along the way. But since this is our first time meeting, I do want to share a few interesting things about me before we get going. You should know about the woman behind the voice. I'm a recovering people pleaser and type A productive addict. My resume is literally the resume of a nomad. Before I became the Hag, I was a teen librarian scouring the books and organizing everything according to label. Probably one of my favorite jobs that should have been my sign. And then I was a horse girl working in the mountains of the Blue Ridge Mountains of Virginia. I worked all through college on a bluegrass, not a bluegrass, goodness. I worked through college on a farm that people could come and like spend time on the weekends. It was like a free family getaway situation. And so I tended the horses there. After college, I became a Capitol Hill staffer, surviving on banquet leftovers, decided that that was not the career for me, and then through a series of happy accidents, I became a special education teacher. I've worn a lot of skins that just don't fit, and trying to be productive for a world that doesn't value rest did not fit well with my nervous system at all. As a matter of fact, it left me burnt out and wondering what I could even offer the world, because I didn't fit into these different roles or modes that I was told that I needed to fit into. So this is sort of my journey of really becoming who I am, based on my experiences. You should also know that I am a Sagittarius sun, a Virgo moon, and an Aries rising. My Virgo moon has a time trying to keep my Sagittarius sun and my Aries rising together. She just isn't, she struggles. And that's totally fine. But that also means that I have a frantic urge to run towards the horizon, but I'm going to stop every 5 feet to make sure that the moss is growing in the right direction because that is super important. I hope you guys know that. But my creed is always, at least these days, is tea first, healing second, mischief always. I believe that being broken is just the first stage of becoming something wilder. Being broken is an initiatory statement. It's an initiatory act in which, whether we choose it or it's forced upon us, to move us into the next phase of things. Um, yeah, trauma does not mean we are broken. If anything, trauma essentially molds us into superhumans. And that's what I hope to share with you all through my podcast on the Shadowroot. Let's get into that murky Texas motel room. The Texas air was sticky and humid when I pulled my small SUV into the roadside motel parking lot in Mount Pleasant. I had made the reservation an hour prior while sitting in traffic, the realization sinking in that I wasn't making it out of Texas that night. Zoe, my dog, whined in the passenger seat. Only 2 nights before, we had been lying in our comfortable bed in San Antonio, praying life would get easier. It hadn't. It had shattered instead. The room was musty, carrying the distinct smell of mildew. It was no 5-star stay, but it was what I could afford. I remember looking at a thin piece of plastic, my credit card, and realizing it was the only bridge between the life I left and the ghost of a future I was trying to reach. I was a ghost behind the wheel of a Ford Escape. And the fact that the universe has a sixth sense of humor naming my getaway car, the Escape, should have said it all. I spent those 48 hours calling every contact I had ever made, my voice cracking as I begged for a foothold. I was outrunning the shadow of a man who had threatened to end my life. Fueled by a quiet, vibrating panic, I called fine. When I finally pulled into my childhood home in southern Indiana, I was trading one landscape of unrest for another. I was moving back into a house that held the very shadows I was trying to outgrow. I was now broke, I was broken, and the bills were beginning to howl. But then the woods called me back. One thing I learned along the way was when you're pacing the limestone paths of the Ohio River Valley with a nervous system on fire, you start to notice something that everyone steps on. And in folk herbalism, there is a quiet green ally called plantain or plantain major, which is an herbal friend for the flattened. This plant grows where the earth is disturbed and flattened and compacted, where the nutrients have been sucked out of the soil in that area. And what it does is with its great big taproot, it dives deep into the soil, bringing up nutrients that it needs, but then also aerating it, making pathways for our moles and our worms and our other bugs to get down into the soil and loosen it up for more plants to grow. Do you see how maybe growing in a compacted area or learning how to grow in a compacted area could loosen up pathways in your own life? We call this plant the traveler's foot because it thrives where that ground has been hard packed by the weary. And I was that person at that time, sitting on that shed at the other side of the lake, tending to the critters I was tending to. And when I learned more about plantain, I realized that folklore whispers about its stubborn persistence. The Romans would put it in their sandals to soothe tired feet, and the Anglo-Saxons called it the mother of all herbs. It was considered to be a way marker. The Native Americans here in North America considered, and I think New Zealand as well, considered plantain to be the white man's footprint because the plant would grow along wagon paths or areas in which European settlers were traveling on fairly consistently. It has a drawing action, and if you ever grew up in the South or Appalachia or in the bluegrass region, and had a granny that when you got a bee sting, she would go out and grab some plantain, chew that up, and then put that on your bee sting. That's what we call a spit poultice, and that's exactly what plantain is great for. Plantain is great as a drawing plant, using it for things like bee stings, splinters, and those sorts of things of drawing that poison out. It's been rumored to even help with snake bites and those sorts of things, but I wouldn't honestly try that. Um, I do, however, use plantain quite consistently in my ouch goop. So if you're watching this on YouTube, you can kind of see my ouch goop on here. It is a salve, it's an all purpose salve created with all sorts of native plants that I have growing in my garden and in my yard. But one of the key ingredients in it is actually plantain for that drawing effects. Because I remember getting stung as a child, and my grandma Betty, who I have written about quite often, about over on my Substack, which I will link below in the notes and everything. But I remember being stung by a bee and her doing the spit poultice action on my hand, to draw that bee sting out. And so that's really my first introduction to plantain. And then I got another reminder of plantain while I was working with the birds. So I do think about that often. I think about this experience often. I think plantain teaches us that the medicine that we need is actually growing right where we feel the most crushed. That's where we find our power. It reminds us that even when we are stepped on, we can pull the poison out of our own skin and turn it into a poultice for the journey. It was the first plant to whisper to me that I didn't need to feel fine. I didn't even need to be fine. I just needed to be rooted. I just needed to be rooted in a place so I could rest. Once I reached back to southern Indiana and to my abusive childhood home, I found work as a naturalist at a state reservoir. I was hired to care for the broken hawks with shattered wings, owls mangled by fence lines, creatures the human world had literally chewed up and spat out. I felt like those birds. I was living in a house of old ghosts, drowning in debt, and I had no career in mind to even think of. But as I sat with those birds in a quiet little shed on the back side of the lake, I saw them surrender. They didn't fight the stillness, they wore it like a protective cloak. I realized then that my failure was actually a frantic shedding of a skin that never fit. This is the forced stillness. The rest as resistance became the foundation to a framework I created called the 9 Steps to 11 Z's, based on rest as resistance and a survival manual I wrote for myself while cleaning cages and watching Lord of the Rings on repeat because it is my comfort trilogy. I watched Bilbo Baggins and I watched The Hobbits, and I learned from them as I was rereading and rewatching the trilogy. And the thing that I learned from them, and it's a quote from Tolkien that I just absolutely love, and I know I'm going to misquote it now because I'm pulling it from the top of my head, but it's if we all valued food and cheer over hoarded gold, we would live in a much merrier world. And I truly believe that. I believe that based on my experiences, based on what I have seen in the world, and how this productive lifestyle, this rat race that we seem to be in, is not, it's not feeding us. It's not feeding good soil. And we have to think of ourselves as those plants. We have to think of ourselves as living in a place that needs to be tended. We have to tend to our good soil. And we can't do that if we're not if we're living in a lifestyle that is constantly in fight or flight, or we are constantly just trying to survive. And that's a lot of us. It's me included. We're all burnout. We're all living. I mean, I don't want to say we're all. That's a generalized statement, but a lot of us are feeling burnout, and we felt burnout for a long time. And so, through my experiences, this moving home from a horrible divorce, from an abusive marriage back into an abusive childhood home, then on to my own for the first time in my whole life, having to pay my own bills and learn to make my own way, and then finding a place where I could literally just rest and learn who I am as a person and what I truly want for my life was such a healing. It was a healing opportunity that the universe strapped me with. Um, but I don't regret it, and I appreciate it. And I talk a lot more about my 9 steps to 11sies and that framework and my journey from there over on my Substack. I will talk more about the 9 steps going forward for sure. This is not the first time that you all are going to hear about my 9 steps. I'm pretty excited to share with you how to just live life as a hobbit. I learned that herbal friendships was better than a hollow career, and that healing required 3 things: good medicine, good story, and good rest. We aren't going back to the world that broke us. I'm not, and you shouldn't either. Together we can build a merrier one right here in the dirt. If the root is my history, the star is my mythic mirror. This journey from the synthetic world to the wild dark is the pulse of my trilogy, The Shadowroot. It is the first book, Lunathire's Heir, where we meet Nettie. And like me, she's a researcher. Like me, she's also forced to go back to a home she tried to outrun. At a funeral, she's handed a book that explains why she sees what she sees. That she is a descendant of a star, Lunathir. She enters the other world, loses a precious memory to the marrow leviathan, and transforms into a stagmare. It is the story for those of us who have realized that our brokenness is actually a celestial inheritance. But Nettie's story, much like my own, is anchored in the river, and the river is starting to wake up. I am the Hag Under the Wood, curator at Elder Creek Apothecary. If you are currently sitting in your own version of that mildewed motel room, I have a seat for you in the shed. Go back to the dirt, find your herbal friends, and trust the mischief and the moss. Next time we're going deeper. We're moving from the shed to the bank, where the spring peepers are singing a prehistoric prayer and a guardian is rising from the murky water to show us the high, lonesome drone of the valley. Until then, take off your armor, pour something warm, the witch rises, and you don't have to walk alone. Until then, stay weird.